understand the world she was born into. Because without that world, her life does not make sense. And most people have never been taught that world existed. There is a community in Coahuila, Mexico, that has been free since 1850. Not free because the Emancipation Proclamation said so. That came 14 years later. Not free because the federal government protected their freedom. Free because they crossed a river and built something on the other side that the American apparatus could not reach. Johanna July was born into that community. El Nacimiento, a land grant in the state of Coahuila, Mexico, held by the Black Seminole people, the Muskogos, since approximately 1850. She was born free on land her people had built free. And she understood, because the community's oral history made it impossible not to understand, exactly what that freedom had cost, and exactly what it required to maintain. This video is about what she built, what she gave, and what the country that asked for her community's service never gave back. The Black Seminoles are descended from enslaved Africans who escaped to Florida in the 17th and 18th centuries, when Florida was Spanish territory. Spain offered freedom to enslaved people who escaped from British colonies. Those people came to Florida, built communities adjacent to the Seminole Nation, and fought alongside the Seminoles in 3 separate wars, specifically to prevent their re-enslavement and removal. They lost those wars, not because they fought poorly, but because the United States Army was larger. In the 1840s, they were forcibly removed to Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma. And in Indian Territory, the specific threat of slave catchers operating with impunity made freedom fragile again. So they moved again. In 1849 and 1850, approximately 180 Black Seminoles under the leadership of John Horse and Wildcat crossed the Rio Grande into Mexico. Mexico had abolished slavery in 1829. The specific legal reality of the Mexican side of the border, no slave catchers, no black codes, no apparatus of re-enslavement, was the reason they crossed. The Mexican government gave them land at El Nacimiento in Coahuila in exchange for military service protecting the northern border from Apache and Comanche raids. They held that land. The freedom was real. And in that community, Johanna July was born. Johanna July was born at El Nacimiento, approximately in the 1840s. The exact date is not documented, which is consistent with the record-keeping of a community that was building a life outside the reach of the American documentation system that had tried to own them. She grew up in a community of people who had built freedom 3 times, in Florida, in Indian Territory briefly, and finally in Mexico. The oral history of that building was not abstract. It was the specific knowledge of what had been done, what it had cost, and what was required to maintain it. She was described by the people who knew her as a woman of authority, not the formal authority of a title, but the specific authority of a person whose judgment the community trusted. She was a healer. She maintained traditional knowledge of plants and medicine that the community depended on in the borderland. She was a keeper of the community's history, the person who knew the names and the stories. When the U.S. Army came to Fort Clark in Texas in 1870 and began recruiting Black Seminole men as scouts, Johanna July was among the community members whose husbands and sons crossed back across the Rio Grande to serve. The Seminole The Seminole Negro Indian Scouts were the most decorated frontier unit in United States Army history. 4 Medal of Honor recipients, 26 combat missions across some of the most dangerous terrain in the American Southwest. They never lost a man in combat. Johanna July's husband, July, the family name the community used, served as a scout. Her son, Pompey Factor, served as a scout. Pompey Factor was one of the 4 men who received the Medal of Honor for the action at the Pecos River in April 1875. Let me describe what that action was. A patrol of Seminole scouts was attacked by a force that outnumbered them dramatically. They held their position, extracted their wounded, and got out. Pompey Factor was wounded in that action. He held his position anyway. Johanna July raised that man. The valor documented in his Medal of Honor citation was built in the community she helped maintain at El Nacimiento, in the specific knowledge that his people had already crossed 2 rivers to stay free, and that what he was protecting was worth protecting. The receipt. Pompey Factor, Medal of Honor, April 25, 1875, Pecos River, Texas. Citation, Distinguished Bravery. Son of Johanna July. one of 4 Seminole Negro Indian Scouts to receive the Medal of Honor from the same action. Source: National Archives, Medal of Honor Citations 1875, Kenneth Wiggins Porter, The Black Seminoles, 1996. The U.S. The U.S. Army promised the Seminole Scouts land grants for their service. This is documented. It was the specific inducement used to bring the community from Mexico back across the border into Texas. The promise that their service would be rewarded with land, the same land rights available to other Army veterans. The Army did not keep that promise. The land grants never came. The rations provided to the families of Scouts were inconsistent and insufficient. When Scouts died in service, their families received nothing. When Scouts aged out of service, they had no land to retire to. Johanna July lived at Fort Clark on the Texas side of the border. She was part of the community that had crossed back from Mexico on the basis of that promise. She watched the promise be made. She watched it not be kept. She kept the community alive anyway. The healing work, the oral history, the maintenance of the tradition that had built freedom twice already. She died in 1927. She was buried at the Seminole Indian Scout Cemetery in Brackettville, Texas, the same cemetery where the Scouts and their families have been buried for over a century. Her grandson, interviewed decades later, said she never stopped talking about El Nacimiento. Not with bitterness, with the specific clarity of a woman who knew that what her community had built in Mexico was the proof that the promise mattered, because her people had already demonstrated they could build the thing the promise was about, without anyone's help. Without anyone's help. This channel is built on one argument. They were here. They built this. The record says so, and the mythology chose not to include them. Johanna July's story is that argument in its most complete form. A Black Seminole woman born free in Mexico on land her people built, whose son received the Medal of Honor for the United States Army, whose community was promised land for that service and never received it, who died in Brackettville, Texas in 1927, still waiting for a promise made in 1870. She is not a footnote. She is the center of a story about what freedom requires, what service costs, and what a government owes the people it asks to defend it. The Muskogee community is still in Coahuila. The descendants of the Scouts are still in Brackettville. The promise made in 1870 is still outstanding. The receipts are in the National Archives. Her grandson's oral history is in the Smithsonian. Pompey Factor's Medal of Honor citation is in the Congressional Record. She built freedom twice. The record says so. If this changed how you see the story, subscribe to the channel. We have 50 more stories exactly like this one, and most people have never heard any of them. The receipts exist. We are just reading them out loud.